I'm Edward, your host, and it's always a pleasure to gather here with you. I'd love to know where you're listening from and which song instantly takes you back to your youth. Leave a note below and subscribe if you'd like to make these mysteries part of your evenings. Now, make yourself comfortable and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Candles set beneath the vicarage ceiling. The vicarage supper was one of those institutions that St Mary Mead regarded as fixed and immutable, like the church bells on Sunday morning, or the way Mrs Dacre's roses invariably won first prize at the flower show. It occurred twice yearly, once in early Lent and once in late autumn, and its purpose was less to nourish the body than to confirm the orderly arrangement of village life. Miss Marple, smoothing her best grey silk as she made her way along the gravel path toward the vicarage that mild March evening, reflected that such occasions had changed very little since her youth. The same careful attention was paid to seating, the same predictable courses appeared upon the table, and the same unspoken rules governed who might speak freely, and who might only agree with what had already been said. The vicarage itself stood behind a screen of lime trees, its Georgian windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple could see the flicker of candlelight within, for Mrs Bunch, the vicar's housekeeper, held firmly to the belief that an electric light was suitable for kitchens, but not for occasions requiring dignity. "Miss Marple, how very good to see you." The vicar's wife, a comfortable woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and a tendency toward practical shoes, greeted her at the door. Mrs Leonard had been mistress of the vicarage for nearly 15 years, and had learned to navigate the delicate balance between hospitality and hierarchy that such a position required. "Mrs Leonard, thank you so much for including me," Miss Marple replied, though they both knew that the invitation had been extended, as it always was, by custom rather than choice. "What a pleasant evening for it." "Indeed, we are particularly fortunate tonight." Mrs Leonard lowered her voice slightly, though not enough to suggest conspiracy. "Canon Whitfield has recovered sufficiently to join us. It seemed only fitting to mark the occasion properly." Miss Marple inclined her head in understanding. Canon Edgar Whitfield had been vicar of St Mary Mead for nearly 30 years before retiring to a small cottage on the edge of the village some 5 years earlier. His recent illness had been spoken of in the hushed tones reserved for those whose mortality seemed somehow unexpected, despite advancing age. That he should attend tonight was significant, Miss Marple realised, and significance in village life was rarely accidental. The dining room had been arranged with considerable care. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the candlelight laid with the vicarage's best china, and with small posies of early primroses at intervals along its length. There were perhaps 16 places set, Miss Marple noted, representing the inner circle of parish life, those whose opinions carried weight and whose presence conferred legitimacy upon decisions that affected the village as a whole. Canon Whitfield himself sat at the head of the table, a position of honour that had been yielded to him without discussion. He was a tall man, somewhat stooped now in his late 60s, with a long, gentle face and the sort of mild blue eyes that inspired confidence. His voice, when he spoke in greeting to the assembled company, retained the measured cadence of the pulpit, warm but deliberate. "My dear friends," he said, rising with some effort as the last guests arrived, "I am more grateful than I can express for your kindness during my recent trial. To see you all here tonight is a blessing I scarcely deserve." The murmurs of demurral that followed were exactly what one might expect. Miss Marple, taking her seat near the far end of the table, observed how naturally defiant ends settled around the canon, like morning mist upon a valley. It was not demanded precisely, but it was certainly expected, and the village had long since learned the difference. To the canon's right sat his wife, Mrs Lydia Whitfield, a woman of perhaps 65 whose composed features suggested both strength and careful self-containment. She wore dark blue silk and a single strand of pearls, and her manner combined warmth with a certain reserve that discouraged intimacy. Miss Marple had always thought her a woman who bore responsibilities quietly, asking for neither sympathy nor recognition. Across from Mrs Whitfield sat Mr Bernard Hale, the churchwarden, a broad-shouldered man in his middle 50s whose competent manner and careful way with language had made him invaluable to parish administration. He managed the church accounts, oversaw repairs, and served as the practical counterweight to the vicar's more spiritual concerns. His wife, a faded woman who smiled often but said little, sat beside him, her role apparently exhausted by her husband's presence. Miss Ruth Ellison occupied a chair midway down the table, her position reflecting her status as parish secretary. She was a woman of perhaps 40, thin and slightly stooped, with quick, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a manner that suggested efficiency without presumption. Miss Marple had noticed over the years that Miss Ellison possessed the particular kind of competence that made her socially invisible. People relied upon her absolutely, but rarely thought of her when she was not immediately needed. Mrs. Joan Mercer, seated near Miss Marple, represented a different sort of parish stalwart. A widow of some 60 years, she had devoted herself to church work with the slightly anxious gratitude of one who feared being thought unnecessary. Her face, round and pleasant, bore the expression of perpetual willingness, and she spoke often of how much the canon's guidance had meant to her during difficult times. The meal proceeded with the stately rhythm that Mrs. Bunch had perfected over decades. Clear soup was followed by roasted chicken, then a trifle that wavered slightly under its burden of cream and crystallized fruit. Conversation moved in gentle eddies, touching upon the spring planting, the upcoming jumble sale, and whether the choir might manage Stainer's crucifixion for Easter. Miss Marple contributed little, which allowed her to observe much. She noted that Canon Whitfield ate sparingly, that Mrs. Whitfield watched her husband with an attention that might have been concern or might have been something else, and that Miss Ellison's gaze occasionally drifted toward the canon with an expression difficult to interpret. It was as the dessert plates were being cleared that the vicar, Mr. Leonard, rose to his feet. The candlelight caught the edge of his spectacles as he cleared his throat gently. "My friends," he began, "we are gathered this evening, not merely to share a meal, but to mark a particular occasion. Canon Whitfield's recent illness reminded us all how deeply his guidance has shaped this parish, and how much we owe to his many years of devoted service. It seemed only fitting that we should honour him formally." He lifted his glass, and the others followed suit. Miss Marple noticed that a folded paper had been placed beside the vicar's plate, presumably containing the formal words of the toast. "Therefore," Mr. Leonard continued, "I invite you all to join me in recognising a man whose wisdom and compassion have been a light to this community for more than 3 decades. The canon, Miss Marple observed, had gone rather pale. His hands, resting on the table's edge, trembled slightly. Mr. Leonard unfolded the paper and began to read, his voice taking on the sonorous quality appropriate to ceremony. The words were everything one might expect, grateful, respectful, and carefully chosen to acknowledge service without suggesting that it had ended. But as the vicar neared what should have been the conclusion, there came a curious pause. He glanced down at the paper, then up at the canon, and Miss Marple saw something flicker in his expression. Uncertainty, perhaps, or mild confusion. The canon himself had risen unsteadily to his feet, one hand still gripping the table's edge. His face had gone from pale to nearly grey, and his breathing seemed laboured. "I must," he began, his voice hoarse, "I must say—" But the words would not come. He swayed, attempted to continue, and then, quite suddenly, collapsed back into his chair with a sound that was neither cry nor sigh, but something terribly final. In the shocked silence that followed, broken only by Mrs. Mercer's small gasp of horror, Miss Marple sat very still, her eyes moving from the fallen canon to the paper that had fluttered from the vicar's hand to the table. She had the distinct impression that something had gone very wrong indeed, and that it had begun long before this evening's gathering. Chapter 2. A speech that did not conclude. Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes, though it seemed considerably longer to those assembled in the vicarage dining room. The intervening time had passed in that peculiar suspension of normal activity that follows unexpected catastrophe, with people moving about, making small ineffectual gestures while avoiding one another's eyes. Mrs. Whitfield had remained seated beside her husband, one hand resting lightly upon his shoulder in a manner that suggested either affection or simply the need to rest it somewhere. Her face retained its composed expression, though the colour had drained from it entirely, leaving her complexion the shade of old ivory. Miss Ellison had been the first to move with purpose, fetching water and cushion and speaking in low, rapid tones to Mrs. Bunch about telephoning for the doctor. The parish secretary's efficiency had not deserted her even in shock, though Miss Marple noticed that her hand shook as she set down the water glass. Mr. Hale had taken charge of the other guests, suggesting firmly but kindly that perhaps the ladies might wish to withdraw to the drawing-room. Mrs. Mercer had accepted this invitation with visible relief, her round face crumpled with distress, but several others had remained, as though departure might constitute some failure of duty. Miss Marple herself had not moved from her chair. There was nothing useful she might contribute to the immediate situation, and she had learned long ago that observation was often more valuable than action. She watched as Dr. Haydock, a capable man in his late 50s who had attended most of the village through various ailments for more than 20 years, conducted his examination with the brisk thoroughness his profession required. The dining room, so recently warm with candlelight and conversation, had taken on a different character entirely. The candles still burned, but their light now seemed less festive than merely inadequate. The remains of the meal sat abandoned upon the table. A peculiarly forlorn sight, Miss Marple thought, like a party interrupted by the unwelcome news. Dr. Haydock straightened at last, his expression grave but not surprised. He spoke quietly to Mrs. Whitfield, then turned to address the room at large. "I'm very sorry," he said, with the directness that came from delivering such news too many times to believe that circumlocution helped. Canon Whitfield has passed. It appears to have been heart failure, brought on quite suddenly. There was nothing that could have been done. The words fell into silence, followed by the soft sound of Mrs. Mercer weeping in the drawing-room beyond. Mrs. Whitfield nodded once, a small controlled movement, and said something too low for Miss Marple to hear. Dr. Haydock patted her hand with the awkward gentleness of a man uncomfortable with grief, but determined to acknowledge it. Had he been unwell recently? The doctor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He had bronchitis in January, I heard, Mrs. Whitfield replied, her voice steady despite its quietness. It took him some weeks to recover. He had seemed improved lately, but perhaps the exertion of this evening. She did not complete the thought, but no one required her to. The explanation settled over the gathering like a familiar blanket. Unfortunate, certainly, but comprehensible. An elderly man recently ill, overexerting himself at what should have been a pleasant occasion. Tragic timing, but hardly mysterious. Miss Marple observed how quickly the narrative took shape, each person contributing small confirmations. Yes, the canon had looked tired. Yes, he had perhaps eaten less than usual. Yes, his breathing had seemed slightly laboured earlier in the evening, now that one thought of it. It was Mr. Leonard, the current vicar, who gave voice to what everyone clearly wished to believe. A terrible shock, he said, his kind face creased with sorrow. But perhaps we may find some small comfort in knowing that he was among friends, and that his last evening was spent in fellowship rather than solitude. The murmurs of agreement were immediate and heartfelt. Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze drifted to the piece of paper that still lay upon the table where Mr. Leonard had dropped it. The formal toast, interrupted before its completion. Dr. Haydock made the necessary arrangements with Mrs. Bunch regarding the removal of the body, speaking in the low practical tones that such matters required. Mrs. Whitfield accepted the offer of Mr. and Mrs. Hale to escort her home, though she insisted first on thanking Mrs. Leonard for the evening's hospitality, a gesture so painfully correct that it brought fresh tears to Mrs. Mercer's eyes. The gathering dispersed slowly, in the subdued manner of people uncertain whether immediate departure might seem callous or prolonged presence intrusive. Miss Marple found herself walking back through the village alongside Mrs. Mercer and Miss Ellison, the former still dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, the latter walking in silence with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Such a good man, Mrs. Mercer said, her voice thick with emotion. Always so patient with everyone. Do you remember, Miss Ellison, how kind he was when my late husband passed? He visited every day for a fortnight. Yes, Miss Ellison said. He was very conscientious about pastoral visits. There was something in her tone that made Miss Marple glance at her more closely, but the parish secretary's expression revealed nothing beyond the expected grief. And poor Mrs. Whitfield, Mrs. Mercer continued. They had been married 40 years, you know. 40 years. I cannot imagine what she must be feeling. Shock, I should think, Miss Marple offered gently. These things take time to settle into reality. They parted at the corner where the lane divided, Mrs. Mercer heading toward her cottage with many backward glances and expressions of distress. Miss Ellison turning toward the small house she occupied near the church. Miss Marple continued alone, her pace unhurried despite the growing chill. The next morning brought the sort of grey, soft weather that seemed particularly suited to grief. Miss Marple, attending to her garden as was her custom, found herself the recipient of several visitors, each bearing the same news delivered with minor variations. Mrs. Dacre, who lived next door and considered herself the village's primary conduit of information, arrived first with the milk still on the doorstep. Of course he had been unwell, she said, settling herself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the air of one prepared to stay. Dr. Haydock said heart failure, quite sudden. At his age, and with the illness in January, it's hardly surprising, though terribly sad, of course. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, pouring tea. Mrs. Leonard is quite distraught. She feels responsible, though naturally no one blames her. How could anyone have predicted such a thing, and during a supper in his honour of all occasions, though I suppose if one must go, better among friends than alone. It was the same sentiment Mr. Leonard had expressed, Miss Marple noted. Tragedy rendered comfortable through repetition. By midday the explanation had solidified into fact. Canon Whitfield, beloved former vicar, had succumbed to heart failure during a testimonial supper. The shock was universal, the sadness genuine, and the circumstances, while unfortunate, entirely natural for a man of his age and recent medical history. Miss Marple sat in her garden that afternoon, ostensibly deadheading the early daffodils, but in reality thinking about the previous evening. She recalled the canon's face as he had risen to speak, pale and strained. She recalled the curious pause in the vicar's reading of the toast. She recalled Miss Ellison's trembling hands and Mrs. Whitfield's unwavering composure. Most of all, she recalled the unfinished sentence, "I must say." What had he needed to say? And why had his need to say it seemed so urgent that even the failure of his own body could not entirely suppress the impulse? The village had settled upon its explanation with remarkable speed, as villages often did when uncertainty threatened comfort. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the swiftest explanations were not always the most accurate, and that grief, however genuine, could coexist quite comfortably with relief. She snipped another faded daffodil and added it to her basket, her expression thoughtful. There were questions that wished to be asked, though she suspected no one else was inclined to ask them. But then, that was often the way of things. Most people preferred their tragedies tidy and their mysteries solved before they had properly begun. Miss Marple, however, had never shared that preference. Chapter 3. Respect shown too readily. The funeral took place on a Thursday afternoon, beneath skies that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. St. Mary Mead turned out in numbers that would have gratified the canon had he been alive to witness them, though Miss Marple suspected that such gratification would have made him uncomfortable. He had been, she recalled, a man who accepted tribute as duty rather than pleasure. The church was full to capacity, with latecomers standing at the back and Mr. Hale moving among them with hymnals and an expression of quiet satisfaction at the turnout. The service followed the familiar rhythms of the Book of Common Prayer, Mr. Leonard's voice carrying through the ancient building with appropriate solemnity. What struck Miss Marple, seated in her usual pew 3 rows from the front, was not the grief itself, which appeared genuine enough, but its extraordinary uniformity, The expressions upon the faces around her seemed cut from the same cloth, sorrowful, respectful, and entirely devoid of complexity. Mrs. Dacre wept decorously into a black-bordered handkerchief. Colonel Melrose, who had served on various parish committees with the canon, maintained a military bearing that nonetheless permitted a certain moistness about the eyes. Even young Mrs. Fletcher, who could hardly have exchanged more than a dozen words with Canon Whitfield in her life, looked appropriately moved. Mrs. Whitfield herself sat in the front pew, flanked by Mr. and Mrs. Hale on one side and Miss Ellison on the other. The widow's composure remained remarkable. She followed the service with steady attention, rose and sat at the proper moments, and sang the hymns in a clear, low voice that never wavered. Only once did Miss Marple observe anything approaching disturbance in that careful control, a moment when Mr. Leonard read from Ecclesiastes and Mrs. Whitfield's hand tightened suddenly upon her prayer book, knuckles whitening beneath the black gloves. The eulogy was delivered by Mr. Hale, who spoke for perhaps 10 minutes about the canon's dedication to the parish, his gentle guidance during difficult times, and his unwavering commitment to Christian charity. The words were well chosen and smoothly delivered, hitting each expected note without jarring or surprising anyone. He gave of himself unstintingly, Mr. Hale said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the church. No task was too small for his attention, no parishioner too humble for his concern. He understood that true ministry lay not in grand gestures, but in the daily work of tending to souls. Miss Marple found herself wondering what might be said of a person when no one felt comfortable being specific. Mr. Hale's tribute could have applied to almost any conscientious clergyman. There were no particular anecdotes, no illuminating examples, nothing that suggested the actual man rather than the general concept of what such a man ought to have been. After the service, the congregation filed out into the churchyard where the interment was to take place. Miss Marple positioned herself near the lich gate, ostensibly to avoid the press of bodies, but in reality to observe who spoke to whom and what their faces revealed when they thought themselves unobserved. Mrs. Mercer found her there, eyes red-rimmed and voice unsteady. "Such a beautiful service," she said, clutching Miss Marple's arm as though for support. "Mr. Hale spoke so well, didn't he? Though really, what could one say that would capture the canon's true goodness?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "He was held in great esteem." "Oh, the greatest. Do you know, when my William died, the canon came to see me every single day for 2 weeks. Every day. And he never made me feel that I was imposing on his time. He always seemed to know exactly what to say to comfort me." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said gently. "And he helped me with the most practical matters. You know how hopeless I am with documents and legal things. He explained it all so patiently and made certain arrangements on my behalf. I don't know what I would have done without his guidance." Mrs. Mercer's gratitude was clearly genuine, her distress at the canon's death unfeigned. Yet there was something in the way she spoke, an edge of anxiety perhaps, or a need to affirm her position, that made Miss Marple file the conversation away for later consideration. The graveside ceremony was brief, conducted with dignity as the mourners stood in small clusters upon the damp grass. Miss Marple found herself near Miss Ellison, who stood slightly apart from the others, with her hands folded before her and her gaze fixed upon some point beyond the proceedings. "A sad day," Miss Marple ventured quietly. Miss Ellison turned, seeming almost startled to find someone addressing her. "Yes," she said simply. "You worked closely with Canon Whitfield, I believe." "I was parish secretary, the position required. Regular contact." The reply was so carefully neutral that it invited no further conversation. Miss Marple tried another approach. It must be a comfort to Mrs. Whitfield to know how much her husband was respected. Something flickered in Miss Ellison's expression, too quick to identify but present nonetheless. "Yes, I'm sure it is." "Did you know him well? Beyond the parish duties, I mean?" "No one knew him well," Miss Ellison said, and then, as though recognising that this sounded peculiar, added, "That is to say, he maintained appropriate boundaries. He was very proper in all his dealings. Before Miss Marple could respond, Miss Ellison excused herself and moved away, joining Mrs. Whitfield with a murmured word and a supportive touch to the widow's elbow. It was the first time Miss Marple had seen the parish secretary demonstrate any physical gesture of comfort, and she found its timing interesting. The gathering began to disperse, people making their way back to the church hall where tea and sandwiches had been laid out. Miss Marple walked slowly, allowing others to overtake her, listening to the fragments of conversation that drifted past. Terrible shock, of course, but at least it was quick. Heart disease runs in families, you know. His father went the same way. Mrs. Whitfield is bearing up remarkably well. Such dignity. The parish won't be the same without him, naturally, but Mr. Leonard is doing a fine job. Every voice struck the same note. Loss tempered by acceptance, sadness softened by reassurance. No one questioned. No one wondered, sneered. No one suggested that there might be anything in the canon's death beyond the unfortunate timing of an aging body's failure. In the church hall, Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and stationed herself near the window where she might observe without being drawn into extended conversation. The room hummed with subdued talk, people moving in familiar patterns, seeking out those with whom they customarily spoke and avoiding those with whom relations were strained. Mrs. Whitfield received condolences with gracious brevity, thanking each person but not encouraging lengthy exchanges. Mr. Hale remained at her side, performing the useful function of steering conversation away when it threatened to become burdensome. Miss Ellison hovered nearby, present but not prominent, ready to fetch tea or a chair or whatever might be needed. Miss Marple watched as various parishioners approached the widow, each offering variations on the same theme: the canon's goodness, his dedication, his kindness. The praise flowed easily, perhaps too easily. It had the quality of words long prepared, sentiments held ready against the inevitable day when they would be required. She noticed, too, that certain topics were delicately avoided. No one mentioned specific instances of the canon's counsel. No one recalled particular sermons or guidance. The tributes remained resolutely general, as though the actual substance of his ministry was less important than the idea of it. Colonel Melrose, standing near the tea urn, was speaking to Dr. Haydock in low tones. "Probably for the best in the end," the colonel said. "He'd never have tolerated being an invalid. Rather go quickly than decline slowly, what?" "Indeed," Haydock replied, though his tone suggested less certainty than the colonel's, though one always wishes for more warning. "But there wasn't anything suspicious about it, was there?" Mrs. Dacre interjected, having appeared at the doctor's elbow with the suddenness of one who had been listening from nearby. "I mean, you're quite satisfied as to the cause?" Dr. Haydock's expression suggested that he found the question distasteful but not unexpected. "Heart failure, Mrs. Dacre, given his recent illness and his age, entirely consistent with natural causes." Of course, I only meant, well, the suddenness of it. One moment speaking, the next. These things happen, Doctor said firmly. The heart is unpredictable." Mrs. Dacre accepted this with a small nod, though she looked faintly disappointed, as though she had hoped for something more dramatic to report. Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Dacre was not malicious, merely possessed of that unfortunate combination of curiosity and lack of imagination that led people to prefer simple answers to complex questions. As the afternoon wore on and people began to take their leave, Miss Marple found herself once more near Miss Ellison, who was collecting empty cups with mechanical efficiency. "It has been a long day for you," Miss Marple observed. "Yes." Miss Ellison stacked 3 cups together with precise movements, but necessary. "You must have known Canon Whitfield for many years." 15. I took the position when I moved to the village. "And in all that time you worked together closely." Miss Ellison's hand stilled for a moment. "As closely as the work required." "But no, closer." The parish secretary looked at Miss Marple directly for the first time in the conversation, her eyes sharp behind their spectacles. Canon Whitfield was a man who valued propriety, Miss Marple, in all things. One learned not to presume upon his position. With that, she turned and carried her collected cups toward the kitchen, leaving Miss Marple to consider the careful construction of that final sentence. One learned not to presume, which suggested, perhaps, that someone had once tried to presume and had been educated otherwise. Chapter 4. Words chosen for the occasion. It was 3 days after the funeral when Miss Marple found herself taking tea with the vicar and his wife. The invitation had come that morning delivered by hand in Mrs. Leonard's careful script, and while it was phrased as a casual offer of company, Miss Marple recognised it for what it was, a request for conversation that required privacy. The vicarage sitting room looked considerably different in afternoon light than it had on the evening of the supper. The curtains were drawn back, revealing a pleasant view of the garden, where early tulips were beginning to show colour. Mrs. Leonard poured tea with the practised ease of one who had performed the ritual countless times, her movements economical and comforting. "I'm so glad you could come," she said, handing Miss Marple a cup. "These past few days have been rather difficult, and I find I need sensible company." Mr. Leonard, settled in his armchair, his teacup balanced somewhat precariously on his knee, nodded agreement. "Shock hasn't quite worn off, I'm afraid. One expects such things in the abstract, of course, but when they occur—" He trailed off, and Miss Marple supplied gently, "They remain shocking nonetheless." "Precisely." The vicar seemed grateful for her understanding. "And there's the matter of the service, you see. I keep wondering if I might have done something differently, noticed he was unwell, perhaps, or suggested he needn't speak at all." "You could not have known," Mrs. Leonard said, though her tone suggested they had covered this ground before. Miss Marple set down her cup with careful deliberation. The toast itself, had it been prepared specially for the occasion? "Oh, yes," Mr. Leonard replied. "Mr. Hale drafted it initially. He has rather a gift for that sort of thing, knows the proper phrases and so forth. He brought it to me several days beforehand for approval." "And you approved it as written?" "I did. It seemed entirely appropriate. Respectful without being excessive, acknowledging the canon's service without suggesting his work was finished. Quite well done, really." Miss Marple allowed a small pause before asking, "Was that the version you read on the evening?" The vicar's hand jerked slightly, causing tea to slosh against the side of his cup. Mrs. Leonard leaned forward with immediate concern, but he waved her away. "That's the curious thing," he said slowly. "I'm not entirely certain. You see, when I went to read it, the words seemed different, somehow. Not dramatically so, but enough that I hesitated. I thought perhaps I'd misremembered Mr. Hale's original phrasing." "The paper you were reading from," Miss Marple said, "had you seen it before that evening?" Mr. Leonard frowned, clearly trying to recall. "I believe so. Mr. Hale placed it beside my plate before the guests arrived. I glanced at it then to remind myself of the wording, but I confess I didn't study it closely by the horse capel. Time I actually read it aloud, well, he set down his cup entirely. I was rather caught up in the moment, and then, of course, the canon collapsed, and everything else was forgotten." "What happened to the paper afterward?" Miss Marple asked. "I haven't the faintest idea. I suppose it's still in the dining room somewhere, unless Mrs. Bunch tidied it away." Mrs. Leonard rose with sudden purpose. "I'll ask her. She's been cleaning the room properly today. We couldn't bear to touch it before now. If the papers are still there, she'll know." She left the room with a rustle of skirts, leaving Miss Marple alone with the vicar. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for permission to speak. "You think there was something wrong, don't you?" he said quietly. "About that evening, about the canon's death." "I think," Miss Marple replied with equal quietness, "that Canon Whitfield appeared to have something urgent he wished to say, and that he did not have the opportunity to say it. Whether that bears any relation to his death, I cannot yet determine. But his heart, Dr. Haydock was quite certain. Dr. Haydock is an excellent physician. I have no doubt his diagnosis was medically sound. but medical soundness does not always account for the human element. Before Mr. Leonard could respond, his wife returned carrying a folded piece of paper, her face troubled. "Mrs. Bunch found it on the sideboard," she said. "It had fallen behind the candelabra, apparently." She handed it to her husband, who unfolded it with hands that were not quite steady. Miss Marple watched his face as he read, seeing comprehension, followed by confusion. "This isn't the toast Mr. Hale wrote," he said finally. "Or rather, it begins the same way, but the ending is entirely different." "May I see?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Leonard passed her the paper without hesitation. The writing was clear, though portions had been crossed out and rewritten in a different hand, one that trembled slightly, suggesting either age or emotion. The opening paragraphs were indeed what one might expect: gracious acknowledgement of service, expression of the parish's gratitude, wishes for the canon's continued health and happiness in retirement, standard sentiments, elegantly phrased. But the final paragraph had been altered significantly. Where Mr. Hale's original presumably concluded with conventional good wishes, the revised version read, "And yet, in accepting your tribute, I must acknowledge what weighs upon my conscience. There are matters in which guidance given was perhaps misguided, decisions made with good intentions that nonetheless caused harm. Respect given too freely can obscure the need for honest examination, and I fear I have accepted both more readily than wisdom would recommend. I am grateful for your tolerance of my failings, though they have not all been named." Miss Marple read it through twice, then looked up to find both Leonards watching her with anxious expressions. "When was this revision made?" she asked. "I have no idea," Mr. Leonard said. "As I mentioned, I only glanced at the paper before the meal. This is not what I saw then, or at least I don't believe it is." "Mrs. Bunch might know," Mrs. Leonard suggested. "She manages the household quite thoroughly." The housekeeper, when summoned, proved to be a sturdy woman in her 60s with the air of one who'd seen much and been surprised by little. She examined the paper with a practical eye. "That's the canon's hand in the changes," she said firmly. "I'd know his writing anywhere. He always wrote his sermon notes in the study when he lived here. As for when he made them, that would have been the afternoon of the supper." "You saw him do it?" Miss Marple asked. "Not precisely, but Miss Ellison brought him here around 3:00. Said he wanted a quiet place to collect his thoughts before the evening. I showed them both into the study and brought tea. When I cleared the tray, perhaps half an hour later, he was writing at the desk. Miss Ellison was standing by the window, looking rather stiff about something." "Did either of them say anything?" Mrs. Bunch considered. "Miss Ellison thanked me for the tea. The canon didn't speak. He seemed absorbed in what he was writing. They left perhaps 20 minutes after that, and I assume they'd gone home to dress for dinner." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and returned it to Mr. Leonard. "And this version, the revised version, is what you read aloud?" The vicar shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I started to read it, certainly, but I don't recall reaching the end. The canon stood up, you see, and began to speak, and I was so startled that I lost my place entirely." "He stood as though to respond to the toast?" "Or as though to correct it," Mr. Leonard said, the realization evident in his voice. "Good heavens! He wanted to say those words himself, didn't he? Not have them read on his behalf." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt with deliberate calm. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "whether Miss Ellison might remember the afternoon more clearly. Small details often become significant in retrospect." Mrs. Leonard showed her to the door. Her pleasant face creased with worry. "Miss Marple, do you really think there's something more to this? Something we should be concerned about?" "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that Canon Whitfield wished to make a confession of some kind, and that he ran out of time to do so. Whether that matters now that he is gone, well, that depends rather on who else knew what he intended to say, and whether they wished him to say it." She walked home through the lengthening shadows, the revised toast occupying her thoughts entirely. Words chosen for an occasion, then words chosen to alter that occasion. and somewhere between intention and execution, a man had died without speaking the truth he had apparently determined to share. The question now was whether that silence had been merely unfortunate or whether it had been in some way assisted. Chapter 5. Benevolence and its Witnesses. The village, having buried its former vicar with appropriate ceremony, turned its attention to the practicalities that death always leaves behind. There were accounts to settle, belongings to distribute, and the subtle rearrangements of influence that occurred when a prominent figure departed the community. Miss Marple, calling upon Mrs. Whitfield with a small pot of preserves, the traditional offering in such circumstances, found the widow's cottage tidy to the point of severity. Every surface had been cleared, every photograph aligned, every cushion placed with geometric precision. It was, Miss Marple thought, the home of someone who had found comfort in order. "How kind of you," Mrs. Whitfield said, accepting the preserves with a faint smile. "Do sit down. I'm afraid I haven't much to offer by way of hospitality. I've been rather occupied with sorting through Edgar's papers." She gestured toward the dining table, which bore neat stacks of documents arranged in labelled folders. Even grief, it seemed, could be managed through proper filing. A necessary task, though no doubt a difficult one, Miss Marple observed. Less difficult than one might imagine. Edgar was methodical about record-keeping. Everything has its place. Mrs. Whitfield settled herself in the chair opposite, her posture erect despite the shadows beneath her eyes. Though I confess some of the parish correspondence has been puzzling. So many letters over the years, requesting advice on matters that seemed quite outside his purview. People often turn to their clergy for guidance in worldly affairs, Miss Marple suggested gently. Yes, but these were rather specific. Financial decisions, property matters, even investment recommendations. Edgar was a scholar and a pastor, not a man of business. I cannot think what qualified him to advise on such things. She spoke with the detachment of one discussing a stranger's affairs, though perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, 30 years of marriage to a man dedicated to his parish had required just such detachment. "Did the advice prove sound?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Whitfield's expression flickered. "I wouldn't know. The letters don't include responses, naturally. But I recall some upset years ago, though it was smoothed over quickly enough. People are reluctant to complain about their vicar." "What sort of upset?" "Oh, something about the church fund allocation. A parishioner felt money had been misdirected, or advice given that shouldn't have been. Mr. Hale handled it all very quietly. He has a talent for preventing difficulties from becoming public." Miss Marple filed this observation away with the others that were accumulating. Before she could pursue the matter, Mrs. Dacre appeared at the cottage door, bearing flowers and an expression of determined sympathy. The conversation shifted to safer ground. Condolences repeated, practical matters discussed, and reassurances offered. Miss Marple took her leave shortly afterward, sensing that Mrs. Whitfield had reached the limit of company she could tolerate. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple encountered a Haydock emerging from the post office. He tipped his hat with the brisk courtesy that characterised his manner. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I trust you're keeping well?" "Quite well, thank you. And you? These have been trying days for everyone." "Indeed." He fell into step beside her. Death is never pleasant, but when it comes so suddenly, the shock lingers. I've had several patients this week suffering from nerves, all connected to poor Whitfield's collapse. It must be difficult when the circumstances are so public. Dr. Haydock gave her a sharp look. The circumstances were perfectly straightforward, Miss Marple. Heart failure in an elderly man recently recovered from illness. There's nothing mysterious about it. "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I imagine you must sometimes wonder whether a patient's emotional state might contribute to physical decline." The doctor was silent for several paces. "You're thinking of the stress of the occasion, the speech he was meant to give?" "I was thinking more generally about the burdens people carry. Canon Whitfield seemed to be a man greatly relied upon for counsel." "Too greatly, perhaps." Dr. Haydock stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. That is, he took his responsibilities very seriously. Sometimes I thought he worried more about others' problems than his own health. Did you treat him often? The bronchitis in January was the most serious illness, but he consulted me occasionally about other matters. Insomnia mostly. Difficulty sleeping when one's mind won't settle. I prescribe mild sedatives, though he rarely took them. A troubled conscience can be more difficult to treat than a troubled body, Miss Marple observed. Dr. Haydock looked at her with an expression that combined respect and wariness. You have a way of seeing straight to the heart of things, Miss Marple. Yes, I rather thought something was weighing on him these past months. But when I asked, he assured me it was merely the natural contemplation that comes with age and illness. Looking back over one's life, assessing choices made, that sort of thing. They parted at the corner, the doctor heading toward his surgery and Miss Marple continuing homeward. But her mind remained occupied with the accumulating fragments. The revised toast, Mrs. Whitfield's discovery of advice given beyond the canon's expertise, the old upset that had been smoothed over, and now Dr. Haydock's confirmation that something had indeed troubled the canon's peace. That evening Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Miss Ellison arrived just as the lamps were being lit, her manner apologetic but determined. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, perched on the edge of the sitting-room chair as though prepared for immediate flight. "But I wanted to speak with you about the vicar's inquiry this afternoon. Mrs. Leonard telephoned to say you'd been asking about the toast." "I was interested in understanding the circumstances," Miss Marple said carefully. "The circumstances were that Canon Whitfield insisted on revising it himself, despite my advice that the original was perfectly adequate." Miss Ellison's voice carried an edge that had been absent in their previous encounters. "He was quite determined about it, though he wouldn't explain why." That must have been concerning. It was irregular. The whole purpose of the evening was to honour him, not to provide a platform for... She stopped abruptly. "For what?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Miss Ellison removed her spectacles and polished them with fierce concentration. "For second-guessing decisions made years ago, for reopening matters that had been settled to everyone's satisfaction, for disturbing the peace that certain people desperately needed." Certain people? Mrs. Mercer, for one. She relied on his guidance when her husband died. If he had stood up at that supper and suggested his advice had been flawed, it would have devastated her. She's barely managing as it is. The defence came quickly, almost rehearsed. Miss Marple recognised the quality of an argument that had been conducted internally many times before being voiced aloud. "So, you believed he was protecting people by remaining silent about these past concerns?" Miss Marple asked. I believe that benevolence sometimes requires discretion, that admitting to ancient mistakes serves no purpose if it only causes fresh pain." Miss Ellison replaced her spectacles with trembling fingers. "Canon Whitfield was a good man who helped many people. If some of that help was imperfect, well, whose help isn't?" She rose abruptly, gathering her handbag with the jerky movements of contained emotion. "I simply wanted you to understand that whatever he intended to say that evening, it would have done more harm than good. Some truths are better left unspoken." After she had gone, Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her sitting room, thinking about benevolence and its many forms. How easily good intentions could become excuses, how readily discretion could slide into concealment, and how very dangerous it was to decide on behalf of others which truth they were strong enough to bear. Chapter 6. The Convenience of Reverence. Miss Marple had learned over many years of village life that church records could be as revealing as any diary and considerably more reliable. They recorded not only births, marriages and deaths, but also the quieter transactions that shaped a community, donations made, committees formed, decisions reached and sometimes reversed. It was with this in mind that she found herself in the parish office 2 days after Miss Ellison's unexpected visit. The office occupied a small room adjacent to the vestry, lined with filing cabinets and smelling faintly of old paper and furniture polish. Miss Ellison sat at her desk, a fortress of organised efficiency. "Miss Marple," she said, looking up with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit and dreading it in equal measure. "May I help you with something?" "I hope you might," Miss Marple replied. "I've been asked to assist with the church history project. You know how these things are. One volunteers for a small task and suddenly finds oneself committed to something rather larger. I wondered if I might review some of the parish records from Canon Whitfield's tenure." It was not entirely untrue. There was indeed a church history project, though Miss Marple's involvement in it had been limited to declining an invitation to join the committee. Miss Ellison hesitated, her fingers resting on the edge of a ledger. "Which records specifically?" "Oh, correspondence mainly. Letters to and from the canon regarding parish matters. I thought they might illuminate how decisions were made, particularly during difficult periods." "The canon destroyed most of his personal correspondence," Miss Ellison said quickly. "He felt it was inappropriate to keep letters that might contain confidential matters." "How prudent of him! But surely there must be copies of official parish business. Matters involving funds or property or appointments." Miss Ellison rose to one of the filing cabinets with the air of someone playing a losing hand but determined to maintain dignity. She extracted a folder and placed it on the desk between them. "These are the official records. Committee minutes, accounts, that sort of thing. All quite routine." Miss Marple accepted the folder and began to page through it slowly. The minutes were indeed routine. Repairs to the roof, plans for the harvest festival, allocation of charitable donations, but between the lines of formal prose, patterns emerged. Proposals raised, discussed, and then withdrawn for further consideration. Concerns noted and then quietly dropped from subsequent meetings. Small disagreements that resolved themselves without apparent discussion. "Mr. Hale seems to have been very influential in committee decisions," Miss Marple observed. "He's an excellent churchwarden, very diplomatic. And diplomatic people know how to smooth troubled waters." Miss Ellison's jaw tightened fractionally. "If you're suggesting something improper—" "Not at all," Miss Marple said mildly. "I'm simply noting that when concerns are raised and then withdrawn, one wonders what facilitated the withdrawal. Persuasion, perhaps, or reassurance." She turned another page and found a notation in the margin, written in a hand she didn't recognize. "See separate file, PG matter, resolved." "What does PG refer to?" she asked. "I wouldn't know. That notation predates my tenure as secretary." But Miss Ellison's eyes had shifted slightly when she spoke, and Miss Marple had observed enough liars over the years to recognise the tells of discomfort, if not outright dishonesty. "Perhaps Mr. Hale might remember," Miss Marple suggested. "As churchwarden, he would have been privy to such matters." "I'm sure he's very busy with his own affairs." Miss Marple closed the folder and returned it to Miss Ellison with a gentle smile. "Thank you. You've been most helpful." She found Mr. Hale that afternoon in his office above the draper's shop where he conducted the insurance business that provided his income. He received her with the cautious courtesy of a man who sensed difficulty approaching but hoped to deflect it through proper manners. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. Do sit down, though I'm afraid I haven't long. An appointment at 3, you understand. I won't keep you. I wanted to ask about the parish records, particularly during Canon Whitfield's earlier years. There seemed to be references to matters that were raised and then quietly resolved." Mr. Hale arranged some papers on his desk with unnecessary care. The canon preferred to handle difficulties discreetly. It's one of the qualities that made him such an effective pastor. "I'm sure, though I wonder whether discretion sometimes prevented legitimate concerns from being properly addressed." "What sort of concerns?" His tone had cooled perceptibly. "Financial advice that proved unsound, perhaps. Guidance offered beyond the scope of pastoral duty, the sorts of things that might trouble a conscientious man in retrospect." Mr. Hale leaned back in his chair, studying her with the assessment of someone deciding how much truth was necessary. "There were occasions," he said finally, "when parishioners felt the canon's counsel hadn't served them as well as they'd hoped, but these were matters of judgment, not malfeasance. The canon acted in good faith, always. Certainly did, but acting in good faith doesn't prevent one from making mistakes. No, Mr. Hale admitted, it doesn't, which is why, when concerns were raised, I made it my business to speak with those involved, to explain that the canon had only their best interests at heart, that misunderstandings could be corrected, and that pursuing formal complaints would serve no one. For the good of the church, Miss Marple said softly. Precisely. The church, any institution really, depends on trust and respect. Once those are damaged, the work suffers. I saw it as my duty to preserve both. By persuading people not to voice their grievances, by helping them understand that their grievances, however sincerely felt, were based on misapprehensions. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this justification many times. The canon gave generously of his time and wisdom. If some recipients of that generosity later experienced disappointment, well, life is full of disappointments. That doesn't make them his fault. Miss Marple considered him thoughtfully. Did Miss Ellison assist you in these efforts? Miss Ellison managed correspondence efficiently. If letters of concern arrived, she naturally brought them to my attention so that appropriate responses could be crafted. And appropriate responses involved ensuring the writers understood that further pursuit would be unwelcome. Mr. Hale stood, signalling the interview's end. Miss Marple, I respect your curiosity, but I must ask what you hope to achieve by revisiting these old matters. The canon is dead. Whatever imperfections marked his ministry, and all ministries have imperfections, they died with him. Digging about in the past serves no purpose except to disturb the peace of those who remain. Unless, Miss Marple said, rising as well, the past isn't quite as settled as we've been led to believe. She walked home through the churchyard, passing the fresh earth of Canon Whitfield's grave. The headstone had not yet been placed, leaving only a simple wooden marker with his name and dates. That evening she sat by her window as dusk settled over the village, thinking about institutions and the lengths people would go to protect them. Mr. Hale had been quite clear. Concerns had been raised and concerns had been managed. Always privately, always with the goal of preserving the canon's reputation and the church's dignity. Miss Ellison had facilitated this process, handling the correspondence that might otherwise have caused difficulty. And what had she received in return? Not gratitude, evidently, nor particular recognition, simply the satisfaction of having protected something she believed worth protecting. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, she had protected it because she feared what might emerge if she didn't. Fear and duty could look remarkably similar from the outside, while feeling entirely different within. The question was whether either emotion, carried far enough, might lead someone to prevent a confession that threatened to undo years of careful concealment. Not through violence, certainly. Miss Marple had no doubt that Dr. Haydock's diagnosis was accurate. But there were other ways to silence a voice beyond stopping a heart. One simply needed to ensure that the words meant to be spoken never reached the intended audience. And if the shock of that interference proved too much for an already weakened constitution, well, who could have predicted such a thing? Chapter 7. What Politeness Prevented. It came to Miss Marple the following morning while she was trimming the roses, as insights often did when one's hands were occupied with simple tasks and the mind free to wander. She straightened abruptly, secateurs suspended mid-air, as the pieces arranged themselves into a pattern that was both obvious and troubling. The toast had been revised, that much was certain. But what had Mr. Leonard actually read aloud at the supper? She set down her tools and went inside to consult the notes she had made. A habit formed over many years of observing village life, where memory alone could prove unreliable. Yes, there it was. Mr. Leonard had said the words seemed different somehow, but that he'd thought perhaps he'd misremembered Mr. Hale's original phrasing, which suggested he had read something close to Mr. Hale's version, not the canon's confession. Yet Mrs. Bunch had confirmed the canon revised the toast that very afternoon. Miss Ellison had been present, and the revised version, with its trembling handwriting and crossed-out passages, had later been found behind the candelabra. Miss Marple sat down at her writing desk, considering the sequence of events with methodical care. The canon arrives at the vicarage at 3 o'clock with Miss Ellison. He revises the toast, apparently despite her objections. They leave together. The supper begins at 7. Somewhere in those 4 hours, 2 versions of the toast had existed, and only one had been placed beside Mr. Leonard's plate for reading. She rose and put on her hat with deliberate purpose. There were questions that required answers, and Miss Ellison was the only person positioned to provide them. The parish secretary was not in the church office, but the elderly sexton, who was sweeping leaves from the porch, informed Miss Marple that she might be found at home. A small, neat house on Church Lane that Miss Marple had passed countless times without paying it particular attention. Miss Ellison answered the door, still wearing her apron, flour dusting her hands. Her expression upon seeing her visitor suggested resignation rather than surprise. "I wondered when you would come," she said simply. "You'd better step inside." The sitting room was spare but comfortable, everything arranged with the same careful efficiency that characterized its owner. Miss Ellison gestured to a chair and went to wash her hands, returning with 2 cups of tea that she had apparently prepared in anticipation of company. "You've realized, haven't you," she said, settling herself with the cup held carefully in both hands, "about the toast?" "I believe I have," Miss Marple replied gently, "but I should like to hear it from you." Miss Ellison was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the tea. When she spoke, her voice was steady but low. "When the canon finished writing his revisions that afternoon, I told him it was a mistake. That confession, public confession, would help no one and harm many." He disagreed. He said truth had its own value, regardless of consequence. "An admirable principle," Miss Marple observed. "An impractical one." There was no heat in Miss Ellison's voice, only the flatness of conviction. I had spent 15 years managing the aftermath of his good intentions, comforting the people his advice had failed, explaining to those who felt betrayed that he had meant well, preventing scandal from touching the church, because once it touches, it spreads. "So you took the revised version." I told him I needed to check it for spelling errors. Transparent excuse, but he was tired and didn't object. We left the vicarage together, and I told him I would return it before the supper. But I didn't return his version. I kept it and gave Mr. Hale's original to Mrs. Bunch to place beside the vicar's plate. Miss Marple sipped her tea, allowing the confession to settle between them. The canon must have realized, when Mr. Leonard began to read. I'm certain he did. That's why he stood up. He was going to say the words himself, since they wouldn't be read on his behalf. Miss Ellison's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. I hadn't anticipated that. I thought once the moment passed, he would let it go, recognize that it was better left unsaid. But he didn't let it go. No, he stood and he began to speak, and then she stopped, her composure fracturing for the first time. Then he simply collapsed. Dr. Haydock said it was heart failure, that nothing could have prevented it, but I prevented him from speaking, Miss Marple. I took away his words, and the effort of trying to reclaim them killed him. You can't know that, Miss Marple said, though her tone was thoughtful rather than comforting. Can't I? I've watched him these past months, growing more troubled, more determined to address what he saw as failures. He barely slept. Dr. Haydock prescribed sedatives. The canon was eating away at himself with guilt, and I thought foolishly that preventing him from speaking it aloud would spare everyone pain. Including yourself? Miss Ellison met her eyes directly. Including the church, which is my responsibility to protect. The canon's tenure wasn't perfect, but it was good overall. More good than harm, despite what his conscience told him in the end. Why should his legacy be defined by mistakes anyone might have made? Why should Mrs. Mercer discover that the advice she relied upon was flawed? Why should the whole parish be forced to re-examine 30 years of trust? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, the canon believed they deserved that re-examination, and you removed his ability to offer it. I removed one method. He could have spoken at any time, from the pulpit, in private conversations, in letters. He chose a ceremonial occasion, A captive audience, a moment designed for celebration. I thought that showed he wasn't thinking clearly. Or perhaps Miss, Marple suggested. He knew it was the only occasion when his words would be heard without interruption or management. When you and Mr. Hale couldn't quietly smooth things over afterward. Miss Ellison set down her cup with a sharp click. You make it sound as though we conspired to silence him. Didn't you? We protected the institution he'd devoted his life to building. Is that so terrible? Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. That depends, I think, on whether you are protecting the institution from scandal, or protecting yourselves from having to admit you'd been complicit in maintaining a fiction. What fiction? That reverence and truth are compatible, that respect for a person requires pretending their mistakes never occurred, that the church or any institution is better served by silence than by honest accounting. Miss Ellison stood and walked to the window, her back rigid. He would have destroyed everything, not just his own reputation, but the faith people had in the church itself. Once you admit your spiritual guide was fallible in one area, people begin to question everything. People are quite capable of accepting fallibility, Miss Marple said. What they find harder to forgive is the discovery that fallibility was hidden from them deliberately. Then what should I have done? Let him stand up and confess to mistakes that would devastate people who still relied on the comfort of believing he'd helped them? Yes, Miss Marple said simply, because it wasn't your choice to make. The words fell into silence. Miss Ellison remained at the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I didn't poison him or strike him or do anything but remove a piece of paper. That was enough to kill him. Then he was already dying from the weight of what he carried. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, but you ensured he died without unburdening himself, and that, Miss Ellison, was not your burden to choose for him. She rose, gathering her handbag, and moved toward the door. Miss Ellison turned from the window, her face pale but composed once more. What will you do? She asked. I don't yet know, Miss Marple replied honestly, but I think perhaps the canon's confession deserves to be heard even if he cannot speak it himself. Chapter 8. A Virtue That Required Silence. Miss Marple spent the remainder of that day in quiet contemplation, not of what had been revealed, but of what remained to be discovered. Miss Ellison had admitted to removing the revised toast, but the confession itself, the specific error Canon Whitfield had wished to acknowledge, remained unspoken. The clues, however, were accumulating like autumn leaves. Mrs. Whitfield's mention of financial advice given beyond the canon's expertise, the mysterious notation about PG matter resolved, Mrs. Mercer's anxious gratitude for help with documents and legal things, and Mr. Hale's careful management of parishioners who felt the canon's counsel had failed them. Miss Marple had learned that the truth of a matter could often be found by identifying who had benefited from its concealment and who had suffered from its revelation. In this case, the church had benefited, its reputation preserved, its authority unchallenged, but someone, somewhere, had paid the price for that preservation. She found Mrs. Mercer the next morning in the churchyard, tending her late husband's grave with the devoted attention that had characterized her widowhood. The flowers were fresh, the stone recently cleaned, and Mrs. Mercer's expression carried that mixture of sorrow and purpose that defined those for whom grief had become a vocation. Good morning, Mrs. Mercer, Miss Marple said gently. What lovely roses. Oh, Miss Marple, yes, William always loved vases. The canon suggested I plant them here, actually. He said William would have wanted something cheerful rather than sombre. Her voice caught slightly. He was so thoughtful about such things. He seems to have been very helpful to you after your husband's death. I don't know what I would have done without him, truly. William's affairs were in such disorder, investments that had gone wrong, debts I hadn't known about. The canon helped me understand it all and make the necessary decisions. Miss Marple settled herself onto a nearby bench, and Mrs. Mercer joined her gratefully, her hand still clutching the gardening tools. Financial matters can be bewildering, Miss Marple observed. Did the canon help you make specific arrangements? He did. You see, William had invested heavily in a scheme that, well, the canon explained that it had been mismanaged and the money was essentially lost. But there was a small insurance policy, and the canon advised me on how to use it. He suggested selling the house. We'd owned it outright, and moving to the cottage I'm in now. Much more manageable, he said, for a woman alone. And was it good advice? Mrs. Mercer's smile wavered. At the time I thought so. The canon was so certain, and I was in no state to question anything. But sometimes I wonder— She stopped, as though catching herself on the edge of disloyalty. Wonder what? Miss Marple prompted gently. Whether I had to sell. The house was large, yes, but it had been in William's family for generations, and the price I received, well, Mr. Hale handled the sale, and he assured me it was fair market value, but it did seem rather low. The new owners made quite substantial improvements, you see, which suggested the house was sounder than I'd been led to believe. Did you ever ask the canon about this? Oh no! How could I? He'd been so kind, spent so much time helping me. To question his judgment would have seemed terribly ungrateful, and besides, he always said I should think of it as providence, that the cottage suited me better than the big house ever had. Miss Marple let this settle for a moment before asking, Do you remember what the notation would have been in the parish records? Your husband's initials, perhaps? Philip Gerald Mercer, Mrs. Mercer said. Everyone called him Philip, but his middle name appeared on all the formal documents. The canon used to make a joke of it, said PG stood for Poor Gerald. Because of the financial troubles, PG, the notation in the parish records, not a reference at all, but a person, a matter that had been resolved through discretion and persuasion and the careful management that Mr. Hale specialised in. Mrs. Mercer, Miss Marple said carefully, when you sold the house, who purchased it? Why, it was bought through an investment company. I never met the actual buyers. Mr. Hale handled all the details. And do you know who eventually came to own it? Mrs. Mercer's brow furrowed. I believe Mr. Hale mentioned once that he'd acquired it for his son-in-law, as an investment property. Why do you ask? But Miss Marple had already risen, making her excuses with gentle courtesy. She walked back through the village with a clarity of understanding that was both satisfying and deeply sad. The pattern was complete now. Canon Whitfield had advised Mrs. Mercer to sell her house, perhaps genuinely believing it was in her best interest, perhaps influenced by Mr. Hale's quiet suggestions about market value and maintenance costs. The house had been sold to a company connected to Mr. Hale, at a price well below its true worth. Mrs. Mercer, trusting her spiritual adviser, had not questioned the arrangement. Later, when the deception became apparent, or when the canon's conscience finally recognised what he had been made complicit in, he would have wanted to make amends. But Mr. Hale would have explained that revealing the truth would devastate Mrs. Mercer, destroy the church's reputation, and serve no practical purpose since the sale was legally complete. Better to let it rest. Better to frame it as a misunderstanding. Better to persuade the canon that his guilt was excessive, his worry unwarranted, his impulse towards confession merely the melancholy of age and illness. And for years it had worked. The canon had carried his burden in silence, had accepted sedatives for his sleeplessness, had tried to convince himself that Mr. Hale was right, that some truths were too costly to speak, until the supper had been planned in his honour, and he could no longer bear to accept tribute for wisdom he knew had been compromised, until he had decided that whatever the cost, he would speak, that he would stand before the parish that honoured him and acknowledge his failure, however partial, however painful. And Miss Ellison, with 15 years of protecting the institution and smoothing difficulties and managing uncomfortable truths, had made the decision that his confession would not be heard. Not from malice, not even from self-interest particularly, though her position depended on the church's stability. Simply from the conviction that silence was a form of virtue when the alternative threatened order. Miss Marple reached her cottage and stood for a moment in the garden, looking at the roses she had been trimming, when understanding first began to dawn. She thought of Canon Whitfield attempting to rise and speak, his heart already failing, his voice already fading, making one last desperate effort to reclaim the words that had been taken from him. The medical facts were exactly as Dr. Haydock had stated. Heart failure, Sir Anya. And final, but hearts could fail for many reasons, and shock was as capable of stopping one as any physical ailment. The shock of realizing that even in death's very presence, he would be prevented from speaking the truth he had finally found the courage to voice. That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the cruelest silence of all. Chapter 9. Miss Marple reflects on the toast. Miss Marple requested a meeting at the Vicarage 3 days later, and asked that Mr. Leonard, Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Hale, and Miss Ellison all attend. The invitation was phrased with such gentle courtesy that no one quite felt able to refuse, though Mr. Hale's acceptance came with a terseness that suggested reluctance. They gathered in the Vicarage sitting room on a grey afternoon, arranged in a semicircle that reminded Miss Marple of nothing so much as a tribunal, though she had no intention of passing judgment. Mrs. Leonard had provided tea, then quietly excused herself, seeming to understand that her presence might constrain the conversation. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, settling herself in the chair Mrs. Leonard had indicated. "I know this is difficult, particularly for Mrs. Whitfield, and I would not ask it if I didn't believe it necessary." Mrs. Whitfield, composed as always in black silk, inclined her head slightly. "I assume this concerns my husband's death." "It concerns the circumstances surrounding it, yes, though I should say immediately that Dr. Haydock's diagnosis was entirely correct. Canon Whitfield died of heart failure, and nothing anyone did directly caused that failure." "Then why are we here?" Mr. Hale asked, his tone hovering between impatience and wariness. "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "there is a difference between direct causation and contributory circumstance, and I believe you all deserve to understand what actually occurred that evening and why." She paused, allowing them to settle into whatever apprehension or defensiveness they required. Miss Ellison sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully blank. "Canon Whitfield intended to make a confession at the supper," Miss Marple continued. "Not a full accounting, I don't believe he was quite ready for that, but an acknowledgement that some of his pastoral guidance had been flawed and that he had allowed concerns about the Church's reputation to prevent him from addressing those failures honestly." "We all make mistakes," Mr. Hale said quickly. "The canon was no exception, but his good work far outweighed any minor misjudgments. I'm sure it did, but the canon himself no longer felt comfortable accepting tribute without acknowledging those misjudgments. He revised the toast that was to be read in his honour, turning it from celebration into partial confession." Mrs. Whitfield drew in a sharp breath. "Edgar never mentioned. I had no idea he felt such guilt. He carried it quietly, as he carried most things, but by the evening of the supper he had decided that silence was no longer bearable. Unfortunately, Miss Ellison disagreed. All eyes turned to the parish secretary, who remained motionless except for the slight tightening of her jaw. Miss Ellison removed the canon's revised toast and substituted the original version, Miss Marple explained. She did so, believing, I think, sincerely that public confession would cause more harm than good, that it would devastate parishioners who still relied on the comfort of the canon's guidance and damage the Church's standing in the community. She was right, Mr. Hale interjected. Whatever Edgar thought he needed to confess, dragging it out at a supper party would have served no purpose except to create scandal. Perhaps, Miss Marple allowed, but it wasn't Miss Ellison's choice to make, any more than it was yours, Mr. Hale. The canon had determined to speak, and you both, with the best of intentions, conspired to prevent him. "We prevented nothing," Mr. Hale said sharply. "We simply managed the venue. If the canon truly wished to confess, he could have done so at any time, in any manner he chose." "Could he?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her gaze was steady. "You had spent years persuading him that his guilt was excessive, his concerns overblown, his impulse toward transparency damaging. Every time he attempted to address past errors, you smoothed them away, convinced him that discretion was wisdom, that protection of the institution justified concealment of individual failure. You created an environment in which the only way he could speak was through formal public declaration, and then you removed even that option. Mr. Hale's face had gone red. The canon was unwell. His judgment was impaired by illness and age. Someone had to protect him from himself. And protect yourself as well, Miss Marple said quietly. Because if the canon had spoken about the guidance he regretted, he would have mentioned Mrs. Mercer. And once he mentioned Mrs. Mercer, someone might have examined exactly how her house came to be sold so advantageously to your son-in-law. The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Hale opened his mouth, closed it again, and seemed to deflate slightly in his chair. It was a legitimate transaction, he said finally. Perfectly legal, the price was fair for a property requiring extensive repairs. Was it? Or did you encourage the canon to advise Mrs. Mercer that the house was more burden than asset, knowing she would trust his judgment? Did you arrange the valuation, manage the sale, and ensure she never thought to question any of it? I helped her, Mr. Hale insisted. She was in no state to manage complex decisions. I simplified matters for her benefit. For your benefit, Miss Marple corrected gently, though I imagine you convinced yourself otherwise. And when the canon eventually recognised what had occurred, you convinced him that revealing it would only hurt Mrs. Mercer further, that she was happy in her cottage, that disturbing her peace for the sake of his conscience would be selfish. Mrs. Whitfield was staring at Mr. Hale with an expression of dawning horror. Edgar knew? He knew about this and said nothing? He said nothing because we persuaded him that saying something would be cruel, Miss Ellison said, quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. We told him that Mrs. Mercer was content that revisiting the matter would only cause her pain, that his guilt was disproportionate to the actual harm done. But he was dying inside from it, Mrs. Whitfield said, her composure finally cracking. The sleeplessness, the melancholy, I thought it was the bronchitis or simply age, but it was this. It was knowing he'd been party to cheating a widow and being told he couldn't acknowledge it. We didn't tell him he couldn't, Mr. Hale protested weakly. We merely suggested. You controlled him, Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice sharp with grief and anger. You controlled what he could say when he could say it, how he could address his own conscience. And when he finally found the courage to speak regardless of your suggestions, you took even that from him. She turned to Miss Ellison. You took his words away, the words he needed to speak, and the shock of that, theft, because that's what it was, theft, stopped his heart as surely as if you'd placed your hand over his mouth. Miss Ellison's composure broke at last. Tears spilled down her cheeks, though she made no sound, her breathing rapid and shallow. I thought I was protecting everyone, she whispered. The church, the parishioners, even the canon himself. I thought preventing the confession was a kindness. That's the problem with deciding what kindness requires, Miss Marple said softly. We convince ourselves that protecting people from truth is the same as protecting them from harm. But truth has its own imperatives, Miss Ellison. There are moments when it insists on being spoken, when holding it back becomes its own form of violence. I didn't mean to kill him, Miss Ellison said, her voice breaking. I know, but you did mean to silence him, and sometimes silence kills as surely as poison. Not through malice, but through the accumulation of small preventions, each one justified, each one eroding the possibility of honest speech, until there's nothing left but the desperate attempt to reclaim what was taken, and even that fails. Mr. Hale stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're suggesting we murdered Edgar through administrative efficiency. It's nonsense, and I won't sit here and be accused. Sit down, Bernard, Mrs. Whitfield said coldly. Once in your life, sit down and listen to truth being spoken without trying to manage it. Mr. Hale sat. Miss Marple looked at each of them in turn. The churchwarden who had confused control with service, the secretary who had mistaken prevention for protection, the widow who had lived alongside suffering without recognizing its source. "I don't believe any of you acted from malice," she said, "but I do believe you need to understand that respect and truth are not the same thing, that honoring someone doesn't require pretending they were perfect, that institutions built on managed silence are more fragile than those built on honest accounting of failure." "What do you want from us?" Miss Ellison asked, wiping her eyes with trembling fingers. "I want you to let Canon Whitfield finish his confession," Miss Marple replied. "Not publicly, perhaps, though that was his intention, but at least to those who deserve to know the truth. Mrs. Mercer deserves to understand what happened to her house. The parish deserves to know that their former vicar died trying to speak honestly about his mistakes. And all of you deserve to stop protecting a fiction." She rose, gathering her handbag with quiet finality. "The canon tried to make a toast that evening," she said. "A toast to truth. However uncomfortable, I think the least we can do is complete it on his behalf." Chapter 10. After grace was finally said. The matter was handled with the discretion that St. Mary Mead had always prized, though this time discretion served truth rather than concealment. Mr. Hale arranged the financial settlement himself, meeting with Mrs. Mercer in the vicarage study where Mr. Leonard bore witness. The churchwarden explained in terms stripped of the comforting euphemisms he usually employed, that the sale of her late husband's house had been conducted at a price considerably below market value, and that this had benefited his own family. Mrs. Mercer listened with a stillness that suggested she had suspected something of the sort for years, but had lacked the vocabulary to name it. When Mr. Hale finished, offering both apology and restitution, she was quiet for a long moment. "I thought it was my fault," she said finally, "that I'd been foolish to own such a large house in the first place, that William had been reckless with money, that my grief had made me incompetent." The canon never said those things directly, but the implication was there in his advice. "I've spent 15 years believing I deserved the small cottage, because I'd somehow failed at managing the large house." "You deserved honesty," Mr. Leonard said gently, "which neither the canon nor Mr. Hale provided. We cannot undo what was done, but we can at least acknowledge it properly." The financial compensation was calculated and accepted with dignity on both sides. Mrs. Mercer declined the offer to repurchase her former home, saying that she had indeed grown accustomed to the cottage and saw no reason to disturb that comfort now. But the money itself, the recognition that she had been wronged and was owed redress, seemed to lift something from her that had weighed there for years. Miss Ellison tendered her resignation as parish secretary 3 days later. Mr. Leonard accepted it with regret but without argument, understanding that she required the clarity of a clean break. She left St. Mary Mead quietly, taking a position with a parish in Cornwall, where no one knew her history, and she could perhaps learn to distinguish between protection and control. Before she departed, she called upon Miss Marple one final time. "I wanted to thank you," she said, standing in Miss Marple's sitting room, with her hat already pinned in place for travel, "though I'm not certain I know quite what I'm thanking you for." "For listening, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested. "You did more than listen. You saw what I couldn't see, that I'd confused my duty to the institution with my duty to truth, that Saun's, however well-intentioned, becomes complicity when it prevents honest accounting. These are difficult lessons," Miss Marple said gently, "and you learned them at considerable cost." "We all did." Miss Ellison adjusted her gloves with precise movements. "I keep thinking about that moment when the canon stood up to speak. If I'd understood then what I understand now, I would have let him, would have supported him even, but I was so certain that I knew better." "Certainty is a comfortable place to stand," Miss Marple observed, "but it's not always the right place." Miss Ellison nodded once, then took her leave with the brisk efficiency that had characterized her tenure in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple watched her walk down the lane carrying a single suitcase, and thought that some departures were less about running away than about making space for the person one hoped to become. The parish records were quietly amended to include a notation about the PG matter, not the comfortable fiction of resolved, but an honest accounting of what had occurred and what restitution had been made. Mr. Leonard read it aloud to the parish council, acknowledging Canon Whitfield's role without diminishing his overall contribution to the community. Some members of the council were shocked, others merely nodded, as though confirming suspicions long held but never voiced. The discussion that followed was difficult but ultimately productive, establishing new protocols for financial advice and ensuring that future concerns would be addressed through proper channels rather than private persuasion. Canon Whitfield was remembered kindly in the weeks and months that followed, but no longer unquestioningly. The tributes at the dedication of his headstone included acknowledgement of his 30 years of service, his genuine care for his parishioners, and his final determination to speak honestly about his failures, even at the cost of his own life. Mrs. Whitfield attended the dedication with quiet composure, though she had placed a single line at the bottom of the stone that had not been part of the committee's suggested text. He sought to speak truth at the last. It was enough. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Whitfield several weeks later at the village shop, both engaged in the ordinary business of purchasing tea and discussing the weather. They walked back together through the churchyard, passing the canon's grave with its fresh headstone gleaming in the spring sunlight. "Do you think he would have been pleased?" Mrs. Whitfield asked, "with how it all concluded?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that he would have preferred to speak his confession himself, in his own words, at the moment he'd chosen. But yes, I believe he would have found some peace in knowing the truth was finally told. I should have known he was suffering. I lived with him for 40 years. Suffering that's been normalized becomes invisible, even to those closest to its source. You can't blame yourself for not seeing what he and others worked very hard to conceal." Mrs. Whitfield was silent for several paces. "Miss Ellison wrote to me from Cornwall. She asked if I could forgive her." "And can you?" "I'm working toward it. She acted from misguided loyalty rather than malice, and there's a difference, I think, though the result was the same either way." They paused at the gate, and Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Whitfield stood straighter now than she had in the weeks immediately following her husband's death. Grief had not lessened, perhaps, but the confusion that had accompanied it seemed to have eased. "You've been very kind throughout this entire business," Mrs. Whitfield said. "Pursuing truth when it would have been easier to accept the comfortable fiction." "Truth has its own imperatives," Miss Marple replied, "though I'll admit there were moments when I wondered whether the cost of revealing it was too high." "But you decided it wasn't." "I decided it wasn't my decision to make. Your husband had chosen to speak. Preventing him from doing so was an interference with his agency, his conscience, and ultimately his right to be heard. Whatever the consequences of truth, they belong to him to navigate, not to Miss Ellison, not to Mr. Hale, and certainly not to me." Mrs. Whitfield smiled faintly. "You would have made an excellent vicar, Miss Marple. You have a gift for seeing clearly without losing compassion." "I'm merely an elderly woman, with too much time for observation and too little patience for comfortable lies." They parted at the corner, and Miss Marple continued homeward through